All right, good morning to the KRUX podcast. These are the podcast interviews that we do after a KRUX Thursday night presentation so that we can reach a wider audience and we keep in touch with our members of KRUX who maybe could not attend live in the lounge when the presenter was speaking in person. So this week we are interviewing JB on the talk that he did on envy, and he gave it the subtitle that it's a sin against the cross. So it was a very good presentation, so rich. I've been telling JB, even when I was thinking about the ideas that I wanted to explore further, I feel like this is at least an honors research project, maybe even a master's, maybe a sermon series. The talk was so rich. It was filled with so many examples from art and literature and scripture, so many challenging ideas. So this interview might not even scratch the surface of all of the ideas that is in JB's head around this topic. And who knows, maybe in the future we will have a follow-up. So I guess I want to start and just pick JB's mind a little bit about, this is now the second time this year that you've used your KRUX slot to explore our relationship with sin. And in which ways do you find sin easy or awkward to talk about? How does your Stellenbosch experience of talking about this topic differ from your Canadian experience when you were a pastor in ministry in Canada?
Hey, well, how's it, Lishan? I think it's been a few weeks since I've done this talk, I think, so all this information has fallen out of my head as well. But so I'll refer to my notes every now and then. But that's a very, very interesting question to ask, because I can't actually honestly say that I had sin on my mind as at least not in the normal way than what one would view sin. I mean, sin normally seems to be something that we identify in other people. I think that's the first problem. And then I think the second problem is that we think of the Christian life in moralistic terms. And I certainly I didn't arrive at doing these talks on these particular topics, which sort of fall ironically within the gamut of the 7 deadly sins, which is something I've had no interest in the past whatsoever. Just in passing, I think one has sort of a vague idea that it is there. So definitely that was not my interest. And in fact, I did a talk last year on hubris, which I suppose would make this sort of a little triad of original, or rather of deadly sins, or capital sins, as Aquinas called them. But really my interest was piqued in this by trying to understand what's happening in the culture around us. Really, this is, for me, was an exploration of what are the hidden mechanisms that has brought us to the place where we are in a culture such as ours. And I'm sure we'll touch on that in the end. So I think that's really how I arrived at this. So ironically, people wouldn't come to listen necessarily to a talk on envy, but actually really it is a talk on an analysis of the culture that we live in. And so your question about the South African experience compared to the Canadian experience is actually a very, very good question, because they're actually very different cultures. In Canada, I think the way you arrive at these, or the way you look at or analyze these topics, a little bit similar to America in the sense that these are part of the cultural wars. What are the mechanisms and the driving forces in the culture wars? In South Africa, we're in a very different place. So it's kind of a question of society and this I would almost say the systemic structures that are, say, in Canadian society. Everything's very polite at the surface. Underneath, these forces are at work, but they express themselves into some of the things that civil society does in order to maintain society, like the secular square and whatever. What are the morals or the values in the secular square? And I just note that being in South Africa, I just noticed that your power went out. So, and I'm not sure if you're still there, Lishan.
We'll kick in a second.
Did you die? Or are you still there?
I'm just waiting for the generator.
Okay, all right.
Sorry, it's the generator switch.
Don't edit this out. This is so people can see the authentic South African experience. Our presentation died 3 times last night as the power failed. But in South Africa, what makes South Africa very different is that These issues related to what are the driving forces, the undercurrents of driving forces, they're much more in your face. They're either economically very, very massively obvious, like an elephant in the room, although people don't often want to talk about it, or political. So I think there's a big difference between these things. There's a sort of a level of brutality, practical brutality related to these. So envy will lead a man to kill another just right off the bat. I mean, that would happen, of course, in a first world society, but it'll be much more psychological and complex and lead to an event. Here, it's just a matter of pulling out a gun and shooting one. So I'm sorry for some of our listeners to speak so bluntly about it, but those are some of the very obvious differences when you come to something like this. Yeah. And of course, you asked a question about Stellenbosch, and Stellenbosch being this unique little hub or bubble in South Africa. I think envy is without a doubt the primary mechanism of cultural aspiration amongst the people in this town, from the students, from schools, in the schools, amongst the schools, to the students, to the people who are able to afford to live in this outrageously outpriced little enclave of South Africa. Yeah.
Yes, we've seemed to have adopted a culture that is so empathetically tolerant of sin, and there's always some therapeutic explanation for it. If I look at all of the reimaginings of our childhood movies, all the Disney villains now have this really sympathetic backstory. Like what do you attribute that to? How did we get here as a culture that every inequity and transgression is just brokenness instead of actual sin and evil?
Yeah, no, actually, that's a very, very good question. I mean, you even see it, and I'm not sure if we're going to touch on it, but Jordan Peterson, of course, looks extensively at the story of Cain and Abel as sort of a prototypical story for the human. For people, mastering the human condition, of course. And I think the crisis for that is that these are all attempts to answer things purely at a human level, while in the past, in history and in ancient cultures, there was either God present as the party that you'd be offended by, or that you would offend, or at least someone else in society. So it's part of this society turning in on itself and away from God, and trying to solve the real human problems almost outside of reality, because I would deem God to be part of reality. I mean, it's impossible to exclude God from reality. Of course, the moment you do that, you just land yourself in an absolute vicious cycle of torment. It's actually and there's almost like a rejection of narratives that keep God as a moral account holder or a judge in the corner of the picture. There's sort of a rejection of that narrative as overtly simple and so on. So let's all deal with it at an internal psychological level. And actually, it just doesn't work. We are unable to solve the problem, because, as you say, we would then say, instead of just saying we are transgressors or this is a transgression, we would say, oh, this is brokenness. In other words, there's so you play into the role that and Peterson's good at this, where he, for example, then when he's confronted by God, Cain says, oh, but what about me, poor me? So he plays down that victim avenue straight away. And of course, God in his goodness and his grace doesn't accommodate his victimhood, but accommodates his status, or at least what would ensue into a vicious cycle of people just killing each other, by putting a mark on Cain, and then sort of the story of humanity goes forwards.
Yeah.
So I think whenever we exclude God from anything, or if you take God out as and I don't quite like this language, but it's true language. If you take God out as an absolute, then any other reference of who God would be the absolute becomes meaningless. So it becomes just words about words, and it has no reference point. It doesn't actually translate into anything. Yeah.
And I understand what you say, the difference between maybe the African experience and the North American experience is it almost seems your proximity to suffering so much influences your attitude towards sin. I watched a interview with a pastor, and the interviewer also said, how do I convince my friend that sin exists, that evil is real? And the pastor just said, just steal his wallet and see his reaction. As long as it's so far removed from you, any pain, any actual, attack on your being, it's really conceptual until you do something as silly as steal your friend's wallet, and then suddenly sin exists. Yeah. So yeah, it's tough in Africa, but there's grace.
There's some reality here that and reality wakes us up. Yeah, for sure.
I found your definitions especially so helpful as a second language English speaker. Sometimes I think things are just synonyms when they're not. And as you especially defined for us the difference between jealousy and envy. So could you just please help us with that again, the right definitions between the two? And then of all of the definitions from the various thinkers that you presented at the talk, which one resonated with you most?
Okay, now that's a very good question. Maybe I should step back a little bit because we've now spoken about things like greed, avarice, and envy, or invidia, which is sort of the Latin form of it, and we'll talk more about that. But of course, pride is kind of the key culprit that's in the mix here. And I was so intrigued. I was reading 1 Timothy the other day where Paul says godliness is a means of great gain, which we all would assume, sort of a devotional life, if it's accompanied with contentment. And contentment, of course, in some sense, or gratitude, and a combination of the gratitude that goes with contentment, is really the opposite of something like envy. I'll define envy in a moment, but I think these are worthwhile things to say, because the sin of pride, as Lewis reminds us, and we haven't really spoken about this in the prior podcast, but pride is really discovered by comparison. What does so-and-so have, and why don't I have it? Or why has this been provided for this person but not for me? And then envy, which Augustine really goes in quite, he really puts his finger on it. He says, envy translates that observation into active sin. And so that's where the action, it sets it in motion. And of course, what's behind all of that, and I'm sure we'll explore this a little bit further, is that if God is the giver of all things, if God is the good giver of all things, why does he do this? So a definition for envy, and then the difference between perhaps jealousy and envy, even though the same words in Hebrew, the same word in Hebrew and in Greek can be translated either as envy and jealousy, a little bit depending on the context. And jealousy, of course, sometimes is an attribute of God. God is jealous for his own people and so on. So we do need that distinction. But the definition, I think, which is a good one, is to start with Aquinas, because Aquinas is the guy who gathers this basket of the so-called capital sins and reworks them as they come into the Latin and the Western tradition. And he defines it, and I'll just read it to be sure I get it right: an irrational anger at the success of others. Or basically, your sense of resentment, or the pain, this weird internal psychological pain, or this sense of discomfort that you experience in relation to the gifts or the good fortune of someone else, and then I think the way to distinguish between jealousy and envy is to say that jealousy is really your desire for something, for maybe the good aspect. I'm jealous of so-and-so's gifts, that could almost be, or you jealous for someone's love, or you're jealous for someone's well-being or something. So it could translate into something that is indeed positive. But envy then is really the resentment that comes from not having it while the other person has it. And so jealousy can actually lead, I guess, to positive action on your own behalf, while resentment is always kind of drinking poison, waiting for someone else to die type thing. It's just, it leads to bitterness, and it's always destructive. It's always hatred. And the great irony of envy, which really is at heart the human condition. This is a failure of the heart following that what happened in the garden. I mean, we see it in the story of humanity, and it's ultimately self-destructive. So the person who then sets out on this journey of resentment inevitably wants to destroy the other out of a sense of envy, but in the end always is destroyed by the own process. So envy is once you sort of scratch the surface on this envy thing, you begin to see it everywhere. Especially you begin to see it in your own heart, and it's sort of the world. It's almost like a little portal that opens into the story of your own life, and you go like, oh, now I understand what was behind my own sense of discontentment and anger and resentment at that point. And then you also realize, and this is what actually led me to it, and from a personal aspect, is also you begin to see the story of my life. You begin to realize that you've actually been done in, or people have opposed you, and you begin to realize, I understand now why my own life is therefore somehow the consequence of someone else's envy. Shakespeare explores this beautifully in Othello, right? And in the end, it leads to wholesale societal destruction. The book of James picks about it. You know, you want and you desire and you do not have. You envy one another because you do not ask. What is the source, he says, of all the quarrels amongst you in James chapter 4? What's the root of all this? And everyone, I think, who reads that text, there's a sense of conviction that comes with it, no matter where you are. And you go, okay, what is the source of all these quarrels and dissensions among you? You envy, you do not have, you do not ask. So there's God, the giver, who now there's this sense of your unhappiness ultimately is directed at him because there's distrust in his provision. Right? Is he worthy of your worship? Because he gives person B more than he gives person A, and you go like, oh, there's injustice. So lots of noble causes are driven on the premise of envy, and it's utterly, it's as wicked as wickedness could be. Yeah.
Right, yeah. And I mean, that's why at KRUX you constantly take us back to Romans, you know, with God being in the dock there and us pointing the accusing finger. And every time at the end, we come back, and when we remember the gospel again, you know, the hand over the mouth is that, what was I thinking, you know, pointing the finger. So I'm grateful how you constantly bring us back to the Romans lectures. To get our mind straight with that, just hear the gospel again, because we accuse so quickly.
Yeah.
I'm still, in my mind, I'm still working through everything that Sir Fast taught us at KRUX. I think it was circa 21, 22, when he presented all these talks and theses on do you really exist if you exist outside, if you're outside of community in an increasingly individualized world. So I'm still wrestling with all of that, those ideas that Sir Fast presented. So I think that's why that is still in my mind, the one definition that you presented from Gerard, so related with me in Gerard's mimetic theory that states that, you know, man imitates desires because he does not know what he should want.
Yeah.
And I don't quite understand why. I guess because I think I'm naturally, my temperament is neurotic. Yeah. To some degree, everything that everyone else has looks a little bit terrible to me in some way. So sometimes I hate as neurotic as I am, but other times I realize it's difficult for me to be jealous because everything looks a little bit terrible at some point. So I was just wondering about that quote, like why does man struggle so much to know what he should or does want? Why is it never enough? And I read a quote also once that says, hell is not getting what you want, and proper hell is getting exactly what you want and realizing it's not enough. And why is it so difficult to know what we should and do want?
I think it's a profound question. I'm not sure I actually know how to answer that. I mean, Gerard's contribution, which I know very little about him, but in relation to envy, it's quite apropos, and I'll say a word about that for the moment. But this question about why it is that we don't, Gerard's point really is that we don't know what we want, and then we look at what others have and we go like, I want that, you know, now I know what I want. And so in other words, envy ironically is then always amongst friends, and in the biblical narrative it's always amongst those people who are close. It's amongst brothers, it's amongst sisters, you know, Rachel and Leah, friends, David and Saul, Joseph and his brothers, Cain and Abel, the brothers in the parable of the prodigal son. And so envy operates amongst friends and that was the point in Stellenbosch. If you live here and you see what car everybody else has drives or what they do for their holidays, you begin to think, oh, that's what I need to want. So and what that suggests to me is kind of two things. The one is that we overestimate our own sense of intellectually, we overestimate our own sense of independence and autonomy and intellectual independence. I mean, we are actually pretty dumb. We can't even make up our own mind what we want. We have to look at what someone else has, and of course, and therein lies something of sin, and envy works within that context, and that's Gerard's point. And it's a very useful point, actually, very, very useful, because it's true. But I think the other thing is that this has to do with who we are as human beings. We are made in the image of God and in his likeness. If we are in his image and in his likeness, and I think Paul certainly makes that point early on in Romans, you know, the wrath of God is revealed against the ungodliness and the unrighteousness. We are meant to be godly and righteous, but we are those things, right? We are those things that we should be. And but underneath that lies the fact that we are created beings. We are made in the, if you want to use the word mimesis, we are made in the image of God, in his likeness. So what should we be wanting? What should we be like? And we are not those things. And of course, what that means is, as human beings, we overestimate our free will, libertarian independence, you know, autonomy, and actually the truth is everything points to the contrary. We're kind of herd animals. I mean, we do the most stupid things as herd animals. Pardon, forgive the word animals. Let's herd humans.
Yeah.
Let's not introduce any of that nonsense. And as Jim Packer always used to say, we are contingent beings. In other words, everything has a sense of contingency in our createdness, and it's the denial of the contingency and the dependence we have on God that leads us to this absolute folly. You know, so the human mind is darkened, foolish. Not only are we transgressors, we are actually fools, and that's a pretty frightening thing, and it's hard for us to look at that and go, okay, and take it on face value, say, okay, that's totally true. We'll even say it, but we won't deeply, we'll try and believe something different. But therein lies something of the biblical truth that is actually critical for understanding even this aspect of envy, which then happens amongst friends, you know, amongst siblings, you know, it's a brotherhood crisis, you know, it's painful. It's very painful.
Yeah, what's that scripture? The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked, who can know it? And then
Exactly.
the terror of being in a society that glorifies the heart's passion above all. Like setting up the most noble cause that you can do is to pursue this desperately wicked thing above all. It's terrifying. It's driving around without the GPS. It is, you know, on your bike, no guardrails. It's just just this desperately wicked thing. It's terrifying.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the argument can be made that some of our greatest political or societal ideals are actually at the heart of this absolute machinery of envy, you know, and certainly in our context, and I'm sure we'll talk about it a little bit more. You know, envy is what drives some of our most noble causes, you know, that is there is a certain terror that comes, and the consequences are phenomenal, and they carry on for generations, you know. So this is a big crisis for us. Yeah.
So Gerard, then, with his mimetic theory, that as an individual we look to the left and the right, and we decide that that's what we want. At a societal level, societies also then look among themselves to find out what they want. And then Gerard goes further, and he posits that this, as you say, envy always leads to some violent, hateful action. It's a fruit of it. And then what Gerard posits is, you know, a society that's in perpetual envy, it has to manifest somewhere. And in his study, he finds that it almost always manifests in some scapegoating. There's always some demographic or some person or something. All of that envy and ire and all of that violence is then focused on. So I was quite interested in that, because obviously Gerard's not referencing to the crucifixion. And I've been really thinking about the crowd in front of Pilate calling for Barabbas, the insurrectionist, because I'm struggling so much with questions of power and questions of violently taking power, and when is it a righteous move. I've been locating myself very much with the frustration of the crowd to have to accept a Messiah that seems to not want to help. That I get. I completely get the crowd being moved through frustration. But what I hadn't considered before is the crowd being moved by envy. And I wonder if it's a bit of a leap for me to try and interpret the crowd in front of Pilate also in an envious sense. Do you think it could be part of the crucifixion story, envy? And what is envy's reaction? Why does it react to beauty and goodness? Like you also said in Revelation, it seems that part of the persecution of Christians is envy. So what is envy's relation to the perfect? And is it reasonable to say that envy played a role in the crowd's mind?
Sure, there's about 20 questions there, and all of them are profound and worth a novel. We need a Dostoevsky novel here to unpack this for us, you know, so we're going to understand the deep psychology of it. I don't know that much about Gerard's theory of the scapegoat, but of course the notion of a scapegoat is a biblical element of atonement, and by virtue of the fact that he identifies the necessity of a scapegoat in order as an explanation of psychological manifestations of interpersonal incoherence and problems, is fascinating, because with the scapegoat notion, of course, is the idea of atonement. How do we do atonement for our sins? Which means that that blood and atonement is never away from society ever, even though we think we have this tendency to think that's a primitive idea. How could we incorporate the notion of atonement into contemporary modern society? And there are a couple of theologians who have explored this axis, which is really interesting, going so far as to saying this insatiable drive, for example, in the USA for abortion is actually driven by this scapegoat, almost this atonement desire, and you can do an analysis and you'll find aspects of atonement or shedding blood, scapegoatism in every culture. And so why is that there? Where does it come from? And I really actually think the biblical story, with all its narratives that lead us all the way up to the cross, because both Matthew and Mark make it explicit that Pilate knew that the high priest and the Jews had delivered him out of envy. Now, what's the biblical precursor? I mean, what are they envious of? I mean, there's nothing to be envious of. You know, here's absolute humility, but somehow humility and gentleness and beauty. And Dostoevsky's novel, The Idiot, brings that out beautifully through the main character. That's a fascinating read, by the way. because at first he's sort of humoured as a fool, but later envy starts operating, and he's the one that that all the action then is taken against, or the character that takes a fall, as it were. But if you start with then the story of Cain and Abel, you know, if that's your first narrative of human interpersonal relationships right after the expulsion from the garden, then you're already down that avenue, because the older brother is envious. But what is he envious of? He's envious of the generosity, the gift, the benevolence of God towards him, but the irony, there's always three characters in play, and we tend to leave the third aspect out of it. So and this is what ultimately leads us to the cross and helps us understand society, is because, you know, Cain is jealous of Abel because his sacrifices are accepted. And of course, Peterson goes on and on about the difference of their life and their life choices and so on. But really what's behind that is God who offers generosity there, and Cain feels it's withheld, though there is this interaction between God and Cain, where God says to him, hey, here is a way forward, you know. But Cain rejects that way, and he chooses resentment. Now and so that's why Peterson says, here's one avenue of dealing ethically, an ethical pathway for you. The other ethical pathway is the pathway of sacrifice. This is the one of resentment and murder. And he lays down two moral pathways in the world. But that narrative is the same with Joseph and his brothers. It's the same between Rachel and Leah. It's the same in the parable of the prodigal son, which is really the parable of the older brother. So there, between the Cain and Abel story and the parable of the prodigal son, you have sort of echoes of the same thing. But the beauty of the parable of the prodigal son, which we as evangelicals just use for, oh, you know, the kingdom, we're always taking the lost sheep. Of course, there's much more. There's at play really the acceptance of the Jewish Messiah amongst his own people, rather his rejection by the Jews who should have received him, because that is God's great act of generosity. And so it is the parable of the generosity of the father, the outrageous generosity of the father. But of course, the older brother takes offense at that. So his offense becomes visible in the domain. That's why John says, you know, how can I know you love God when you treat your brother with hatred? Because there's a direct connection between what happens horizontally and what happens vertically. And so he hates the actions and the things related to this despicable younger brother who just played it up Nazareth. But actually the real object of the hatred is God himself. And because how can God be good if this is how he dispenses with his generosity? Surely I am more deserving, surely for whatever reason. And that just takes us to the heart of everything. And the story of Job, which is another sort of a counter kind of a mirror to the story, where the great question of Job is, if Job does everything right but everything goes wrong, is God then still worthy of our worship? And the answer, of course, is yes. You know, God remains worthy of our worship even if the absence of all these good things are there. So and then there is Jonah and his envy at the Ninevites. So you see all the biblical narrative starts packing up and stashing up. And ultimately, the object of all of this is, how does God wisely dispense of this world? Where am I in God's plan? And that's the story. Each of us become part of that narrative. We inescapably part of that. And so when Jesus comes along and in him is God's ultimate act of generosity and receiving and spending time with prostitutes and sinners, and then ultimately this life of self-sacrifice, we follow the script. Humanity follows the script. And so the resentment grows, and though they can't pinpoint it, actually the resentment is at God, and because Jesus ushers in the kingdom, the reign of the kingdom of God, the reign of God, and there's only one way: they're gonna kill him, right? And it's with Joseph and his brothers. What are they going to do with Joseph? You know, if it weren't for the pleading of oldest brother, you know, they would have killed him. So, and yet providentially that becomes God's act of rescue. And so in Jesus too, so it's all these typos, and then the antitypes, the narrative leads us in that direction. So yes, I think biblical, walking the whole narrative of you, walking the story of humanity, walking the biblical story, we should have known that it is out of envy that they delivered the Son of God. There's no surprises there. It's just an odd, but when we read it, we can't make sense of it because we've lost the narrative, right? The narrative of the human story. And so there's no surprises there, and that's exactly why, yeah.
But that's exactly like we spoke about that at the talk too. That's such your first clue that it's not about the other person, but that is that is how difficult it is to communicate the envy and have people sympathize with it. We spoke about that, where if you've ever tried to explain to someone why you are envious of someone else and what is that thing that's provoking you, and you feel like a victim because you're thinking, okay, but I'm only provoked because you have this thing, so it must be origin is you and the victim is me, and if you didn't have this thing I wouldn't feel like this. But then the moment you explain that to someone else, and that is not their point of desire, the thing you are envious for, I don't know if anybody's ever looked at you like you're crazy. It's just like, that is the lamest thing to desire. And you realize that hatred is it's so from inside of you that it doesn't actually even translate to someone else that you explain. Whether you are envious of someone's husband that is for someone who's never had the desire to marry, and they're thinking that's the lamest thing you can be envious of, or someone's money to someone who grew up with wealth, or someone's opportunities or education, and you realize, oh, it's not that I'm being provoked. There's something that's not universally provoking, it's just provoking me. So maybe the problem is inside of me. That was such an interesting moment for me, especially when we started sharing in the lounge a little bit, things that do provoke us to envy. And you can just see there's just no aha moment where people are resonating with each other's desires, because it's like, how can you be envious of that? That's so silly. I don't want that. But this thing, let me tell you.
That's exactly right. Now, when I mentioned my example, people were shocked. It's like, oh, what's wrong with you?
It's like such a lame thing to want. And you're sitting there and you're feeling like, if somebody actually reveals to you how lame the thing that you are feeling so hateful about is, you just, how? This is my every waking thought, and it's actually so lame to someone else. Then you realize how like little children we do act about desire.
I discovered, because I'm often working my studies here at home. Then I walk across and I tell Corli this, or I think this. I say, oh, did you know what so and so did? And did you know that these people have got these things? Because I'm like thinking about all these things, and this comparative game of pride is so alive within me, And she has a standard response. She said, well, I'm just warning you, do not desire their life, because then you get their troubles as well. And I go, oh, okay, right. Like, let's just back off. Let me just not desire that thing, let me not be envious of that, because with that comes a basket of other things, So that's why Paul says godliness, and you would think that godliness is enough, right? It's not just holiness, it's godliness. It's different language in the New Testament. But Paul says godliness is indeed a means of great gain if accompanied with contentment. And that is it's like a left hand, it's like wow, okay, right, here I am gaining my godliness, but I lack contentment. It's no gain. There's no gain in that. So
the big aha moment for me during your talk, when I finally understood the heart of your talk, was when you spoke about the story where Jesus had his feet washed with the expensive perfume, and the resentment that came from that. So was I right with that? Was the correct aha moment that now I get it? It is a resentment to God. It's not so much to the person that you perceive as having the thing you want, but it's the wastefulness, the wastefulness of how dare God have the wealth and the power and the authority to dispense with his things as he sees fit. Can you maybe just talk us through that idea again? And I would love to record just that moment that really summarized your talk for me.
Well, we have several accounts in the New Testament of Jesus, obviously, of him kind of being anointed as in a sense for his death, and that the story of the woman who would do this would be told whenever the gospel is told. I mean, this one I made reference to is in John's gospel, where it's Mary who takes this this precious nard and pours it over his feet and anoints his feet, and it's extravagant, because this is normally these oils are extremely expensive. They're often in a sealed glass jar. They're often part of a woman's dowry. So there's an extravagance to that act that in economic terms is of huge significance, but Judas looks at this, and he looks at this act towards Jesus, who then now embodies within himself, of course, the kingdom of God. And not even to talk about the fact that he is the Son of God, God himself incarnate, but because that's not really what's at play there. But I mean, just the fact that there's this recognition of how of receiving God in Jesus, and my gift is appropriate. And Judas looks at that, and he takes offense at her. He takes offense at this action, and then his comment is clearly economical. Look what we could have done with this stuff. What a waste, and funnily enough, his resentment at that moment, you kind of read as the narrative unfolds as sort of a little turning point that ultimately leads to the betrayal. And you begin to see, okay, right, he's actually exposed his own heart. And this is the thing with envy, is that the things that come out of our mouth, even if we walk them back, so there's something that came out of his mouth, and he was able to check what he said. He said, oh, what a waste of money. We all know what he really wanted to say, and so we might frame it in the right words, but actually it came out, right, and that catapults that thing in one direction, right, and to the resentment ultimately, which turns to hatred and to death, and then self-destruction. So it's a perfect story in relation to that. And the crowds who shout, crucify him, crucify him. There are other aspects that happen there that are politically in relation to the kingdom of God, but ultimately it is personal, because God is a person. He has his face turned towards us, and his face towards us in Jesus, and that's why this is such a critical thing. And of course, the interesting thing about that is that all great writers and all great artists and all people who are aware of human psychology and so on, who've expressed that in the arts, all have envy and jealousy, and the machinations of that are a deep part of the narrative. So this is so much part of our human cultural story. I mean, this is the story of humanity. It's inescapably so. And when we turn to the Bible, we kind of poo-poo it as if these are such blatant, obvious things. Yet it's the narrative that actually gives rise to all these other narratives. Someone like Dostoevsky, for example, whose novels are so deeply interwoven in how entangled sin is with all these things and how these things work out. Then, yeah. So
that's why I appreciated your talk so much, that it had that tagline that it's a sin against the cross, because I find that the moment that you can understand sin in its context against God, it becomes so much more than just a silly, moral, counterintuitive rule some authority figure has taught you. So I feel like the first time I really understood the problem with lying is not the deception to other humans, but the fact that I'm trying to create reality in my own image. Every time you speak a lie, you reject God's reality, and you supplement your own reality that you've created with your tongue. And when I saw it in that context, I was like, oh, it is the actual iniquity is in the playing God, in the controlling of what is real. And I found after your talk, I also understood envy not so much in the resentment of the other for having, But in the wanting to play God with the dispensing, I'm not so much angry at the person for having it. I'm angry at God for not dispensing as I would have dispensed.
Exactly.
And it's the bigger context that does the big aha. Suddenly it's not, I mean, I care about my neighbor. I don't want to hurt my neighbor. But it's way more offensive to me to think that, what if God says, okay, fine, you be God. Along with it comes all of the responsibilities. That's far more scary for me. So yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for phrasing it in terms of the cross and not in terms of the neighbor.
I see, and we, yeah, that's right. And you know, sin, obviously, you know, the definition is to miss the mark. I mean, that's what the language suggests. But you know, and we just think, oh, miss the mark, I didn't do the right thing. The missing the mark means you miss the purpose of human existence. You miss the way, the answer, the way that God made the world. You miss the meaning of life. You know, that's really what, you know, and so all sin then is sort of seeking the mystery of the universe outside of the way that God has revealed it ultimately in Jesus. And that makes sin an entirely different prospect to deal with. But the delight of Jesus coming and then us being in Christ, in other words, hidden in his death, you know, his death to death and sin, and his life, he's you know, being risen from the dead, is the new life that comes from that, makes the whole ethical thing in biblical theology an entirely different thing, much more joyful, much more hopeful, much more goal focused, right? And now we can bring in the discussion about the law and the Torah and everything too, but we're not going to do that. That's for
Davey, what makes your talks, and also I think the KRUX community so much richer, is your other vocation as an artist. So your talks always include these incredible depictions. So you showed so many personifications and depictions from myth and art and literature. I was wondering, of all of the examples that you showed, which one you found personally most compelling?
Yeah, I mean, there's different genres in art that you can go to. I mean, there's a cover slide in Angelo Bronzini's work, which is just titled Jealousy, but of course it could at the same time have been titled Envy, but it has this absolute sense of anguish, the human, and that's really what you want. It's how would you depict Shakespeare, you know, or Shakespeare's novels? I mean, how would you, and you'd always find this kind of character. So that would be one. The other one that I showed, particularly when we looked at, and we haven't really spoken about that, but the Hebrew language for envy often just means to be kind of red in the face. That's sort of one group of language, and it's always of the face, interestingly, and that's another avenue for discussion. But also the evil eye, that's the other way that it is depicted, which is so interesting, because Jesus talks about the fact that if your eye is good, your whole body is good, in the sermon, just following the Sermon on the Mount, which is all very, very intriguing. And so the evil eye, obviously all this stuff actually is taken up in secular literature, and even in Greek mythology and so on. The other image that I showed was an image by, let me just read the artist's name so I can get it right. It's Jacques de Bakker, or de Bacher, a Flemish 16th century artist who depicts envy as envy is most, or invidia, which is the Latin god for basically a goddess of retribution and envy. And I mean, she's pretty awful, but she's a player in this arena of the gods. And the Greek word for her is nemesis, and we use that often. I've met my nemesis. What's your nemesis? Well, it's the place of your ultimate destruction, right? The prophets say, you know, there are many things a person can stand against, but who can stand against envy? Who can actually stand against envy? In other words, it's a destructive force. But invidia literally comes from the Latin invidere, to look. So the evil eye idea, and the color green associated with her, but she's often a witch-like emaciated figure, because she's consumed by this power of envy, and so she's kind of thin and a witch, and often with the physicalities that come, like, for example, in de Bakker's image, you know, she's got these sort of drooping breasts, sorry to be so blatant about it, and consumed by it, and often they will consume their own heart. So a lot of the Bruegel's paintings, you'll always see envy eating her own heart, which I think are all quite powerful depictions of it. The modern versions of envy are all these really sort of sexed up, glamorous, almost like Met Gala type young woman who then represent jealousy or envy. So really culture is making a mockery of something which in the older art, like this very wiry, hideous, emaciated witch with pendulous breasts, eating her own heart, is a very ugly figure. And some of the older etchings and paintings, the figures are always hideous, in order to depict the nature of the human heart. There are a few modern artists that have picked up on that, but not very many. So the contemporary image of envy is really actually making a mockery of what they're really dealing with, and it's prevalent. It's actually it's almost presented positively in contemporary culture, right? Which it's always a bit of a surprise when that happens. Both a surprise and not a surprise when that happens. Yeah,
I really liked Andrew's comment. How it reminds him of the graphics card company name, and then Andrew also made a really valuable contribution to we like to talk about and study envy as ourselves, as the person experiencing envy and how to handle that. But he called us out, in the lounge with how much do we also seek to provoke envy by what we choose to post, and how much of our participation, especially on platforms like Instagram and LinkedIn, how much is it that hope and that kind of dopamine release you get from knowing that you are actually provoking envy in someone, that you have the power to move someone to hateful anger just by the things that you've so superficially achieved or think you can do or have. So I really appreciated that from Andrew. Just check your own heart. How much are you sharing? And especially I get so cynical about these LinkedIn posts that always start with humbled to announce that, and you're not humbled to announce your amazing partnership or opportunity or promotion.
Good thing I'm not on the platform, but social media is pretty wicked. You always had in soapies, you had the character and the disaster that's played out by the person who's envious. But nowadays, if you actually read the news and South African and overseas news, you see how murders related to social media persona is actually, I would say, almost at the rate of 1 or 2 a month that you can read about it. Really, you're absolutely right. So the ancient sins play them out in broad daylight in front of a far larger audience, and we're still unable to name it, which is pretty scary. We've lost a lot.
With this, what we're reverberating, that envy is a sin of our age. How do you see it being expressed at a societal level? How is it the sin of our society?
Thank you. I think that's a question that we shouldn't leave out. How is envy perhaps the sin of our age? And there are people who've really explored that. There is a German scholar who wrote a text on envy, who not only looks at it at the personal level, but at the societal level. And he'll say that he'll actually argue, and I haven't read the text, but he'll actually argue that totalitarian governments are driven ultimately by a form of envy, that envy is the root cause of this. And ironically, he makes the case that in very democratic societies that strive towards radical egalitarianism, that envy is the same driving force in there. But I think it's really important to and I think we made 3 conclusions, and I'm actually just going to refer to the ones that I made at the talk, that about envy, and that envy is not just sort of an ancient archaic sin that you see an odd artwork, or you look at the Sedis. You have to be a Roman Catholic to believe in the 7 deadly sins or something like that. It's actually really worthy of our consideration, because it becomes a driving force in our age. In fact, the point is made by several contemporary theologians, basically arguing that envy is the kind of the characteristic sin of our age, Doug Wilson calls it, says that we live in the midst of a resentment revolution, a resentment revolution. I really like that term, and we live with the culture and the ethics of victimhood, and that's a pernicious animal. That, and so we're consumed and devoured by envy. We're actually all now living as the descendants of Cain rather than descendants of Abel. And when you look at the book of Revelation, you see that play out in the light of the faithful witnesses in relation to those the beast, and who pursues these faithful witnesses. Also, envy is kind of an invisible, the second thing being envy being an invisible driver in politics and many of our culture wars. I mean, often expressions of racism are actually driven by issues of envy. These things need to be said. We can't not say them. I mean, they really are, because early on we spoke about the fact that these things are really driving the major cultural machinery of our age, and sometimes we jump on the bandwagon saying it's a good thing, but really actually it's driven by something that's really on a totally different platform. So we've actually jumped on the wrong bus, and it's difficult to know that and to make decisions. So we do live in a culture of death and a culture of resentment and a culture that's out to destroy. I think there's no doubt about that, and particularly by those people, even though they're in the minority, hold a majority sway over the agenda and the forces that are exerting its power on society. And we actually need some real biblical clarity on this and just call it for what it is, as some popular figures out there do, and they suffer the consequences of calling it out. And actually, I think the last thing to note is that envy really then is the invisible mainspring of all human conflict. When brothers fight against brothers and sisters against sisters, and church and I think of our situation amongst the many congregations, even in this town, and the interaction, and you're kind of appalled at how we've all fallen for the devil's lie. Because it is the devil's lie. The devil's lie is really provoking envy. Did God really say, why is he withholding from you? There's something better out to you. You could have had that. And so envy takes root right at the beginning. We call it pride, but the devil entices along the same way, because he's a liar and a deceiver, and therefore the enemy. So I think we should know that in terms of the forces that actually stand behind a lot of cultural movements that we're all wrestling with, and both for good or ill, and it's complex. None of these things are, it's not just complicated in the sense that we can unravel it. They're complex because you need wisdom. But we also then need biblical wisdom, and biblical wisdom says, watch out, what is actually the deep force that's driving this agenda? And when you look at that and you open your mouth, you will receive opposition for calling something for what it is. So we are entering the age in which the Christian church, in standing up for what is true and biblical and being discerning, will face the consequences. And we've got to decide early on, very early on. Now is the right time to decide how we're going to choose. There's no later time. The time is now.
Some very, very difficult statements to make, especially in public, so early into a culture that's very much, like we said in the beginning, still seeped in therapeutic sympathy. And this is one of those things that, give it a decade and the culture is already turned, that people will pretend that they've always been saying this. But this is one of those things that the first people to say it are the ones who take the arrows and take the hits and take reputational slander. 10 years later, everybody pretends that they've always known that this is the case. So it's exciting, and I'm glad that KRUX is in that space of not just culture analysis but also culture creating, saying the things that should be said but maybe will not be received as hotly yet. So wielding culture, it's a scary business, but I'd rather be involved in it than miss the adventure. But it's brave statements for now. The pendulum will swing, but for now it's very frontline speaking. So yeah, so I think you are spot on by calling envy, at least one of the major sins of our age. Yeah. But to maybe end on something a bit more hopeful, what is the remedy? How, now that we're able to identify it in ourselves, how shall we then live to try and counter it?
Yeah, I think first we need to introduce the biblical narrative and all its depth and all its cultural relevance, so that we can actually begin to see again that in the light of this false narrative, this distortive narrative that leads to entanglement. Here is a narrative that shows you the extent of the entanglement and the difficulty and the falseness of what is out there with the truth alongside it. So we need to draw near to the biblical narrative. And of course, when you draw near to the biblical narrative, which ultimately leads us to the sacrifice of Jesus, you begin to see in the New Testament the power of thanksgiving and gratitude. Now that sounds so trite when you say it, but actually that what God has accomplished for us in Christ. This is really where Jonah is sitting under the unpredictable plant, as Eugene Peterson calls it, and he's just angry and bitter, where he becomes the antithesis of and because there's a sense in which God's ultimate provision, even for a place like Nineveh, is ultimately in the cross. So Jonah becomes a very important narrative leading us ultimately to the coming of Jesus, and then God's provision in Jesus. If we really understand the gospel, Paul can say, even in your most difficult times, in the greatest things, make all your requests known to God with thanksgiving, all your petitions, your requests with thanksgiving. So thanksgiving is a sort of word that slips under the table because it's such an ordinary word, but it's actually remarkably present in the New Testament. So gratitude becomes the great antidote for envy. I think one of the best, and I think we did talk about this quite a bit, but life is hard, life is contorted, life is difficult, and we wrestle with God's providence, God's story with us, God's story with me. Okay, Lord, why are you withholding this from me? I mean, surely I deserve this or whatever. And you can lie awake and roll around in your bed at night and wrestle with these things and shout out at God, which I think you should, which I think we all should. I think we should not be quiet, or we should wrestle with God about it. But then you ask yourself, so how do I make then sense of God in my life? And one of the greatest antidotes is to say, okay, discipline yourself. Wake up in the morning and say, okay, and you're in that state of contorted psychological machinations around your discontent. And then you say, okay, how has God been good to me in my life? Let me just say 5 things I'm grateful for. And I tell you, by the time you've named 5, you can name 10. By the time you've written down 10, you can write down 20, and you begin to see, oh, how all these things that I'm envious of have just fallen off the table in the light of the overwhelming goodness of God toward me. And of course, sometimes we're blinded, sometimes we're not going to see it. But I think if we have that kind of discipline, we have some small kids. You see even small kids driven by envy and discontent, small children, and you go like, wow, you have everything, and you're well provided for, yet you're driven by, where does this come from? And yeah, so Corli has this discipline of them being grateful for things. It's fascinating. Changes behavior almost instantly. Within a few minutes, it's a different person. You're no longer green. You are, I don't know, healthy. I don't know what a healthy color is, but certainly very healthy. Yeah.
As you and I also spoke, it's that awe of the mystery of, especially in these times, like in South Africa, how you can see God's judgment on society and then yet experience His grace for the individual. And somehow the grace of the individual parts is greater than the judgment of the society, and
Yes.
yet how God can balance both of these. It's such a mystery to me. How can I feel so blessed and yet be living in such a broken society, such a society under judgment? I don't know
Yeah.
how God does that. I feel the weight of judgment, and yet I feel the glory of grace, and somehow he does both at the same time. It's astounding. The mystery.
You spoke about that quite a bit. I thought that was very interesting observation to make. Yes, we can both live in a culture, we can be alive in the midst of a culture of death, and a context of death. Yeah, it's yeah, it is, and you need that. That's so part of the human story. You read stories of war, of men in war, and sitting in the trenches. There is grace and light everywhere. In the midst of the darkness, so it's very hopeful, actually. Yeah.
Debbie, thank you for your time and for preparing the talk in the middle of hiking the Cedarburg and rushing back to do the talk for us, and then still having the time between your conference papers and all of your responsibilities to even do this interview. I really appreciate you. Thank you for guiding KRUX through such really important topics. I feel like we're really growing here, so thank you for your guidance.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you for the good questions and the fabulous interaction, Lishan. I think your questions are more perceptive and penetrating than the paper was, but it's good. It's always good to have a few bites at this meaty subject.
Yeah, and when you have a moment, if there ever is time for a blog post, it would be so good to have your down, but just survive your deadlines first.
All in good time. Yeah, cool. All
right, so then for anyone that stumbled upon this podcast, that maybe was browsing YouTube and have no idea what KRUX is, we're a community in Stellenbosch. We are culture explorers and thinkers and analysts and makers. We are artists, we are musicians, we write stories and poems and songs. We get together, we eat good food. If you want to join us in the lounge, we meet almost regularly on Thursdays for talks and presentations. It's called KRUX Thursdays. We have an artist gathering conference coming up where we have artists who display their work and talk about their work. And it is a Christian community for culture makers. So if you want to find out more about us, you can visit at krux.africa. And that's our website, or you can just mail me, lishan@krux.africa, for more information and invitations to any of our upcoming events. And yes, thank you, JB. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Lishan. Super job. Well done. Thanks.
See you in the lounge.
Okay. Cheers. Bye.